going to describe findings from a couple of studies we did on groups of, one group of Canadian students and one group of Scottish students. And what actually we did with these was that the initial part of the study was identical for both groups, which is quite interesting. They diverged a bit subsequently. But initially, they first of all, well, among other things, they completed the short form of the EQI, so that was the emotional intelligence measure. We had personality mini-markers, so we got the 5-factor model of personality traits for them. They completed a coping scale, the SIS. Perceived stress, the same scale as in the last presentation, actually, the perceived stress scale. Positive and negative affect. I've probably forgotten something. No, I think that's a lot. Okay, so initially they both did the same measures. At a later stage for the Canadian group, we were actually able to do a repeat measure of stress. So we got them, first of all, at the start of the academic year, and then again towards the end of the academic year, immediately before exams. So we got pre-exam stress for that lot, which is interesting. For the Scottish group, we didn't succeed in getting that, but a proportion of them did allow us to retrieve their exam marks at the end of the academic year. So we've actually got a nice behavioural outcome from them. So slightly different endpoints, but a common starting point for these two groups. Now, of course, having measured all those variables, you've got a horrible, complicated multivariate soup. You've got too much stuff to deal with. So partly as a device, and partly driven by observation in this and many other studies, that emotional intelligence and coping subscales are typically quite highly correlated. Stage one of the data analysis was just to do a joint factor analysis of the scale scores for the EQIS and the coping scales. And what was rather nice about that was that if you do that, you get a similar 3-factor structure for both groups. What came out of it was one factor which is very obvious to label emotional regulation. It's got a large negative loading from the SIS emotion-focused coping scale, and then it's got positive loadings from EQI, intrapersonal, and stress management. So that's sort of emotion regulation factor. Another one that came out, which we call task focus, had loadings from task focus coping and the EQI, what it's called, adaptability scale, which has similar kind of content. And then finally there was one we called avoidance, which contained the 2 avoidance subscales of the SIS, distraction and social diversion coping. So that was sort of starting point. You've got these 3 scales. And they were pretty consistent in factor structure between the 2 samples, apart from a bit of an oddity with the EQI interpersonal scale, which didn't load consistently. Everything else was pretty consistent, as you can see. These are the actual factor loadings. This was to do with a paper reviewer. We omitted general mood. Yeah, we were told to omit general mood second time round, but apart from that, same factor analysis, pretty much the same pattern of what the factors come out looking like, except that, where is it, interpersonal isn't quite sure what it's doing. But apart from that, pretty consistent, so that's quite neat. So 2 different nationality groups, similar kinds of outcomes. So what do you do with these once you've got them? I've gone backwards, haven't I? That's better. So we've now reduced our data a bit, so it's a bit more manageable. Next thing to do is to look at the whole correlation matrix, which I'll refrain from showing you because it's still enormous, but summary of some of the main correlations up there. Large correlation between stress and neuroticism, no surprises there. Large negative correlation between stress and that emotion regulation factor, that makes a lot of sense. Other things, stress and personality, you see things like negative correlations with extroversion and conscientiousness, but much weaker than with the main big correlation with neuroticism. Other things, stress weakly negatively correlated with that task focus factor, but again, much less of an effect than with the emotion regulation factor. That seems to be the main thing that's going to be related to stress when we do some modelling in a minute. The end of year mark, the interesting actual objective outcome in the second group, that was correlated with negatively with agreeableness, which is interesting, positively with the measure of positive affect, and positively with that task focus factor, and oddly, not significantly, only marginally, with conscientiousness, which is a bit weird because conscientiousness, as we all know, is a great predictor of academic success. So that's sort of there, but it's not strong in this group for whatever reason. Other slight oddity with this group was that stress didn't have anything to do with year mark. You tend to think the more stressed students would do worse, but in fact we didn't see that in this group. So that's what we have. So our basic things we're interested in, we're going to look at in detail around stress and that end of year mark. This is the schematics of what we tried to do. Because there's a lot of history of coping being a mediator of the effect of personality on stress, and some evidence also coming through for emotional intelligence. We took our composite factors and constructed that kind of model. So personality, coping, BI composites mediate the effect of personality on either stress or academic performance. So that's what we're trying to do. And that looks nice and simple. This looks horrible, of course. Study 1. One thing I need to explain, stress is kind of expanded into 3 boxes here. That's because we actually got, first of all, for these people, a measure of stress over the last year. So that's stress as a trait. How much do you tend to self-report that you're stressed? And we also got repeat measures of stress over the last week. So how stressed were you over the last week? And that's at time 1, start of the semester, year, and time 2, just before the exams. So it goes up if you look at the data, unsurprisingly. So we're sort of what's feeding into that block there in our model. As the correlations indicate, biggest effect is here, emotion regulation, and that traces all the way back to neuroticism, unsurprisingly. So this is neuroticism. You're high on N, you've got bad emotion regulation, you end up more stressed. So that's sensible. And a much smaller effect, there's a kind of route here from conscientiousness, task focus, but this is much weaker. So the kind of take home at this point is your stressed students are the ones who are highly neurotic and have poor emotion regulation. Study 2, just to confuse you, the model's done differently. It's two different journals. If we'd written up for 2 studies, 1 paper, it would have, So this time, we've actually, what was missed out of that last model was we had measures of positive and negative affect. So this time we've combined things up, extroversion and positive affect into a positive emotionality factor. Negative affect and neuroticism into a negative emotionality factor. Once you've done that, pretty much the same story. Emotional regulation is the main thing driving stress. Well, I have to be careful saying driving because study 2 we're only cross-sectional, so this is all data taken at the same time, but that's the strongest path, and it traces back again to more strongly to N and negative emotions, but also in this model back to positive emotions and extroversion to some extent. And conscientiousness, task focus factor, actually you're not doing anything, so it's all about emotion regulation. Life satisfaction is related to the task focus factor. So far so good. So let's pick, although the models look different, it's the same kind of picture. It's emotion regulation, stress, what you'd expect. Academic success, now that looks simpler because it had a relatively sparse pattern of correlations, unlike self-reported stress just correlates with everything. But there were very few correlations of exam mark. So we see this, now this is the task focus, this is still this composite of EQI adaptability and this task focus coping, mediating the effect of positive emotions and conscientiousness on overall mark, and this direct path from agreeableness as well. So that's nice. So what do we do with it? Well, okay, there's various things. I mean, we've seen that EI and coping style are related. That's pretty well known. The extraction of the 3 consistent factors was a nice result for the for the 2 different groups. Now, the nice thing about these factors is that as we're going back to the idea of intervention, as in the previous talk, we've got things there we can target. We now know, okay, you're stressed vulnerable students, they're high on neuroticism, you can't do anything about that, but you can target, if you wish to, in an intervention program, their poor emotion regulation. So that gives a possibility of something that you can do if you wish to help students who are going to become stressed when they're at university. And you can look at the sort of coping subcomponent, the emotion-focused coping, or you can look at the emotional intelligence subcomponents, or you can just look at the overall emotion regulation, but it gets you to the same point. That's the thing to intervene on. Similarly, for academic success, what we picked up here was that it's a lot to do with this idea of the task focus factor, which contained task focus coping and EQI adaptability, which actually, if you look at the adaptability, it looks terribly like a coping scale anyway, and it looks like task focus coping, so it's not so surprising they appear together on that factor. This example item, when facing a problem, the first thing I do is stop and think. So that sort of thing you can target if students are vulnerable to academic failure. You can try to teach them to be more task-focused. I mean, it might be difficult, but you can certainly try to think up a program that would do that. Or you can even, that's interesting, you can even try and target positive emotions, because as in 1 or 2 other studies, these results are suggesting that positive emotions as such may be helpful to students in their studying. And there is a theory which suggests how that might be happening, which is the broaden and build model. So, I mean, obviously our data gives us no evidence one way or the other as to whether this is actually happening, but the broaden and build model gives the idea of positive emotions as this resource building, approach goals, broadening of attention generally. So a bit opposite to the kind of narrowing of attention that might be the case if somebody was very distressed about their studies. But if they broaden their attention, they can bring into play the kind of resources they need to actually be successful. So that's something that could be looked at further. I think the other issue that comes up from this analysis is a theoretical one. I mean, we threw EI and coping scales together into a factor analysis because you've got to do a data reduction in this situation to save your life, really, to be able to do anything further. But I think the issue of the overlap and distinctness of EI and coping is one which deserves further attention. I mean, I think in the case of the example on the previous slide with the EQI adaptability scale and the task focus coping, they look as if they're very, very similar to each other. But I would think in general we'd end up concluding, and probably longitudinal studies could show this, that it's in fact EI is acting to underpin coping rather than being exactly the same kind of thing. It's the emotional resources that you bring to dealing with a stressful situation which would be likely to feed into your choice of coping strategy. So I think it's that kind of dynamic. But again, our study doesn't allow us to really look at that. But I think that's an interesting problem for the future. One more. The other missing link in all this is, of course, we've looked at trait EI. We've looked at emotional intelligence as assessed by self-report, so self-perceptions or emotional capabilities. It's obviously interesting to look at ability EI, which actually hopefully assesses the capability to perform on emotion-related tasks. And fortunately, there has been some work on this recently, not done by us, but there's a very nice paper has just come out using a couple of different ability EI tests, I think, which again, for academic success, coping also assessed, showed this link to task-focused coping again, and also highlighted emotion management as an EI component that was particularly important to look at. So picking out the same kind of things that came out of the study with self-report EI measures. So that's interesting. So that can be looked at further. And I think we need to work out perhaps what's our best predictor in terms of student stress and success, whether we should be using trait measures or ability measures, or maybe both. And the last point, obviously, this is just scratching the surface in that each of these studies was just a mixed bunch of students who volunteered to fill in questionnaires. It would be interesting to target different types of students. I mean, what works for engineers might not work for psychology students, we don't know. So there would be a way to develop this work further by looking at specific student groups. And obviously different degree programs and also different types of assessment. I mean, does what help people cope best with exams also help them to cope best with coursework? I mean, you can think of things like interpersonal skills and group project work, for example, might highlight a different pattern of associations from what we've seen from this rather broad brush study, averaging over all different kinds of students, different kinds of assessment. Okay, that's it. Thank you.